call the member for Deakin.
Well, thanks very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. I rise this evening to speak about a matter of great importance to me and many people in the Australian community, and I hope and believe for many people throughout our world, and that is the persecution of Christians around the world. We hear much in the media, the commentariat and elsewhere, about the persecution of various groups globally. And often this is warranted, and it's important to recognise that our efforts as Australians and as a Western world to fight against these injustices are often informed by the Judeo-Christian values that underpin the values of our country and our civilisation more broadly. And yet, in our world today, the undeniable reality is that it is those of a Christian faith who are the most persecuted people in the world. This persecution can often be at the hands of intolerant majorities of other faiths or militant groups, but it's more often than not state-sponsored persecution against Christians that takes place and is becoming increasingly widespread. Of an even greater concern is that this state-sponsored persecution often comes at the hands of governments who receive funding in the form of foreign aid from Australia, as well as other Western, nominally Christian countries. One shocking recent example is that of Asia Bibi, a mother of 5 in Pakistan, who has essentially been sentenced to death for the crime of being Christian in a Muslim-majority country, after a recent sentence hearing on a charge of blasphemy. What was her crime, you may ask? Well, she was alleged to have told colleagues that Jesus would have taken a different viewpoint to Muhammad when she was asked not to drink from the same water supply as the Muslim residents in her village, as they believed that she would soil the water supply with her unclean Christian hands. After Asia Bibi allegedly said that Jesus would take a different view, a Muslim replied, "How dare you question the Prophet, you dirty animal?" 3 other women joined in, shouting, "It's true, you're nothing but a dirty Christian." This is sadly just another example of the ongoing persecution and terror that Christians face in Pakistan. Christian women and girls are regularly abducted in Pakistan. Some are killed, others are forced to convert and marry, and many are never heard from again. And this is all occurring at a time when Pakistan is a huge beneficiary of foreign aid funding from a number of Western nations. From Australia alone, Pakistan will receive more than $55 million in aid this year. Other places, such as the United States and the United Kingdom, give at even higher levels. Clearly, it's a grave concern that Australian taxpayer dollars would go to a country and government that carries out such egregious human rights abuses directed at a particular minority, in this case, Pakistani Christians. If Pakistan does carry out the execution or refuses to release Bibi, Australia should cut all aid and consider further sanctions, including sporting bans that would necessarily include the Pakistan cricket team. This would send a strong message to the world that Australia will always stand up for persecuted minorities, not least the Christian communities that the world seems to have turned its back on. But unfortunately, this intolerable situation is not limited to Pakistan. In the Middle East, the starry-eyed optimism of the Arab Spring in 2011 has long since given way to disorder and chaos, with the religious minorities of the region, including Christians, suffering the most. In those territories that have fallen under the control of the Islamic State, some of the world's oldest Christian communities have become victims of a killing spree with savagery seldom seen since medieval times. Captured Christian and Yazidi men have been ritually beheaded on camera in obscene jihadi snuff films, while captive women are cast into a lifetime of sexual slavery. Early last year, for example, IS publicised a video featuring the choreographed decapitation of 21 Coptic Christians on a Libyan beach. But this sort of persecution is not just a problem in territory held by IS. In Egypt, since the overthrow of the Muslim Brotherhood, the government of President al-Sisi has made a genuine effort to improve the status of Egypt's besieged Coptic Christian community. But old cultural prejudices and patterns of socio-economic oppression at the hands of its Muslim majority continues to exist and has proved to be deeply entrenched in their society. A US State Department human rights report on Egypt confirms, and I quote, repeated instances of sectarian violence against Coptic Christians, detailing how a primary school teacher was dragged into court and convicted for the crime of insulting Islam when teaching the history of religion. In Lebanon, the birthplace of my father, the Maronites of that country, a successful and influential part of its society, are caught between the Shia group Hezbollah on one side and the Sunni jihadism of IS on the other. Again, an intolerable situation for that minority. But sadly, the Christian population throughout the Middle East continues in its decline due to this systematic persecution, and it's all but been wiped out in places where it was the strongest, and indeed places where it has been since the birth of Christianity. Over the last decade, almost 80% of Iraq's Christian population have fled their own country. In Syria, a country that only a few years ago boasted a Christian population of 2 million people, only has 1/10 remaining. Millions of some of the most productive members, entrepreneurial members of that society have been forced to leave their homeland, and their homeland is the worse for it. Only in Israel, where freedom of religion is guaranteed, has there been a steady increase in the Christian population amongst those in the Middle East. If it weren't for the work of organisations such as the Barnabas Fund and others, the crisis, which I have very, very briefly touched on this evening, would be receiving even less focus. Our media do not seem interested in this issue and do not seem interested in championing the cause of these persecuted Christian minorities. And that is why I am taking this step in speaking about it in our Parliament tonight. We must continue to do more. Through our foreign policy, we must ensure that this crisis of Christian persecution gets the attention that it deserves within the international community, let alone our own community. Where necessary, sanctions must be deployed against countries that continue to allow this systematic and state-sponsored persecution to continue. Otherwise, how will we address it? Should this form of state-sanctioned persecution, such as the case of Asia Bibi in Pakistan, continue, a swift response is required, and as I've said, a withdrawal of foreign aid. The world is rightly concerned and appalled by the use of the death penalty for various crimes in our region. Then why do we not talk more about the death penalty that is applied to often Christians on trumped-up charges of blasphemy? This is one of those cases. So the question we must therefore ask ourselves is, how do we turn our backs on this barbarism, mete it out to those who practice a faith that is the bedrock of many of the values that we hold dear? In concluding, I'd like to commend those, including Herald Sun columnist Rita Panahi, who's chosen to highlight these issues. It's not popular, but she's chosen to highlight these issues, along with many other people in our community who have brought this crisis into focus. In doing so, I urge the wider Australian and international community to urgently pressure your representatives and your governments to treat this problem with the attention it so desperately needs.